First of all, I'd like to say welcome, I hope this next half hour, 40 minutes or so of speaking on my part will provide you with an interesting and, I hope, exciting look behind the scenes at our freshwater program, and I hope, more excitingly, a sneak peek into what we're calling our Living Rivers campaign. Very early days for this, but as Hadley mentioned, what we're planning and beginning to plan is something visionary, long-term, and inspiring, I hope. The notion of a Living Rivers campaign for WWF is really a product of the past 3 years of our work on freshwater across the country. It's a product of our projects on the ground, our relationships around policy advocacy, and other initiatives to raise public awareness. And what we found in that process is that there is, for us, we believe, a huge opportunity to scale up the work that we have been doing to have an influence on a national scale. I thought I would start with a quote from one of the many books about freshwater that sit on my shelf at home. This quote comes from a book by Fred Pierce called When the Rivers Run Dry. And Pierce's book, I highly recommend this book. It is a very readable and a very thorough look at the health of the world's rivers and at the mounting pressures on the freshwater that makes those rivers what they are. What this quote really resonates for me is that there is nothing more pressing, more important to the future of humanity on this planet than the health or the fate of our rivers. That quote by Fred Pierce looks forward a century to what we need to begin doing. I'm going to try to go backwards a century or so. Over the last 100 years plus, we humans have done a remarkable job of managing and manipulating the flow of fresh water on this planet. We've managed and manipulated it to meet our own needs and desires, our needs and desires for food, for electricity, for the fibers we use to make our clothing, for urban and industrial development. When you look at the global numbers, they are, as they tend to be, quite astounding. In 1950, there were 500 large dams on the planet. Today, 6 decades later, that number has risen to 45,000, over 45,000. That is, on average, 2 large dams constructed each and every day for the past 50 years. Right now, we divert 400 billion cubic meters of water from its natural course. That's 400 billion cubic meters of water diverted through canals, pipelines, and other infrastructure. We divert it from places where it is, in streams, rivers, lakes, to places where we need it to grow food and to nourish our cities. That 400 billion cubic meters, just to give it some context, is enough water to keep the Fraser River flowing for 3 years. For those of you who live in southern Ontario, where our rivers are a little smaller, if we leave out that big St. Lawrence River that we share with others, that 400 billion cubic meters of water is enough to keep the Grand River, the watershed that I call home, flowing for 42 years. So it's a massive amount of water. Of course, these efforts are what have allowed us to prosper on the planet. We are now a population of 6.8 billion people. That population is expected to rise to 9 billion by 2050. Our global economic output is estimated in the range of $60 trillion a year. These are direct products of our ability to manage and manipulate the flow of fresh water. They've been remarkable developments, and they have reaped massive rewards, massive benefits for us. But somewhere along the way, we left a crucial stakeholder out of the water conversation. We forgot about nature. The water we use when we turn on the tap for a drink, when we generate electricity, when we grow our food, and we fuel our industry, is water that we share with all life on Earth. While we've been busy trying to figure out how much we can use, we have, for the most part, neglected to ask how much nature has to give. That thinking is really the thinking behind our freshwater program at WWF and the thinking behind the Living Rivers campaign. But it's also the thinking behind some of the most innovative science and policy happening around freshwater in the world today. I'm going to dig a bit deeper into this thinking around how much water nature needs. And I thought I'd do it with a bit of a story. a personal story. And I'll warn you, it's a little bit embarrassing to let you know that this story, a story about a moment that changed my life, involves an academic journal. Maybe that goes back to Hadley's comments in his introduction about being educated. But bear with me. At the time, I was working for an organization that Hadley mentioned called the Polis Project on Ecological Governance, a small water policy think tank based out of the University of Victoria in British Columbia. Our work at that time was largely focused on figuring out how to get Canadians, and more specifically Canadian cities, municipalities, to be much more water efficient. And it's certainly a worthy cause, given that when one looks at the statistics, Canadians are, in our urban centers, the world's most wasteful water users. But I always had this kind of nagging so what feeling in this work. What I was searching for was a way to tie it back to what had inspired me in the first place. Inspired me to get involved in the environmental field, inspired me to get into water policy specifically. And that was a tie back to nature, a tie back to the rivers and lakes that I paddle my canoe on, to the pond across the street, across the road from the farm I grew up on in rural Ontario. So the big moment with the academic journal came when I was doing some research and this paper unfolded on the screen in front of me. And the second it did, this paper, but more specifically actually the title of the paper, really reframed the way I look at water issues. It really very much set me on a new course and a new way of understanding and approaching the freshwater challenge. It also has a lot to do with why I'm here in front of you today, because this question of how much water a river needs, how do we secure water for nature, lies at the heart of WWF's work around the world. We are actively conserving some of the world's most important rivers, the Amazon, the Mekong, the Zambezi, and here in Canada, the Skeena, the Athabasca, the Mackenzie, and the St. Lawrence. All of our work around freshwater at WWF comes back to a fundamental principle: water for nature and water for people. So far, it may have sounded like I'm setting up a little bit of a nature versus people situation here, and that is in fact not the case. When we protect nature's water needs, when we deal with this question, how much water does a river need, we are in fact also dealing with water for people. Addressing nature's water needs also addresses water for people, for folks like this, or for this guy, and these people. So while I can't really speak for the people in the first two slides in that set, I will take a second to speak for these folks. This is a great shot of my family in our trusty canoe at Grundy Lake in Provincial Park in Ontario, here in Ontario a couple years ago. And I can assure you that protecting water for nature matters a lot to these folks. A little side story, my wife Carol actually is also involved in the world of water policy, so it certainly matters to her. The jury's still out on the little guy in the front of the canoe. I was telling a story the other day that we recently installed one of these low flush toilets that makes a large sucking sound when it flushes. So in some respect, because he is enthralled with this thing and constantly flushing it, he's keeping us in business. We'll get him, I'm sure. This brings me to the vision behind this Thinking for a Living Rivers campaign here at WWF. What we want to do with this campaign is ensure that Canada's rivers have the water that they need to remain productive and healthy for all time. Our vision, as we've stated it in our strategic plan, is to see clean and abundant fresh water flowing in all of Canada's rivers, providing the foundation of a secure water future for nature and for people. To go back to the science behind this, it turns out when you ask this question, how much water does a river need, it's a little more complex than just asking how much. It's not just how much that matters, it's the variability in when and where water flows that matters to the health of ecosystems. So when we say how much, we talk often about Canada having somewhere in the range of 20% of the world's fresh water. Well, that's a bit like me telling you that you have 8 to 10 pints of blood in your body. It's an important fact, interesting fact, but not particularly telling when you think about your overall health. Now, if we talk about blood pressure, we're talking about something that gets your attention. So just like blood pressure in the human body, it's the flow and the variability in flow of fresh water that is a fundamental indicator and a fundamental driver of river health. So much to the chagrin of our communications team and even the major gifts team, I'm sure, I've snuck not one, but 2 academic journal articles into my presentation. Bear with me. There's an important point to be made with this one. The first point I'll make is that this is a seminal paper in the scientific world behind what we're talking about in our freshwater program and in the Living Rivers campaign. So just to reinforce that, as always, WWF's work is grounded in sound, solid science. But what I'd like to draw your attention to, actually, is the box or the bolded text right in the center of this, this page. Because this is how the academic world talks about the importance of healthy rivers and river flow. The ecological integrity of river ecosystems depends on their natural dynamic character. That means tremendous things to me. Probably not a lot to you folks. Probably not a lot to the average public. So, one of our jobs, and one of the things that I believe we do incredibly well here at WWF, is take what is often obscure scientific jargon and turn it into something that is meaningful and understandable for the average public. So, this is how Martin Mittelstadt at the Globe and Mail captured, in essence, the same idea about the variability, the importance of the variability of flow in rivers. The seasonal waxing and waning of rivers is one of nature's most crucial cycles, influencing everything from the success of salmon runs to having enough water during parched summers to irrigate crops. So I'd be happy to hear your thoughts on this, but I would suggest that he's turned some pretty obscure scientific jargon into pure poetry. I much prefer Mittelstadt's quote these days. What he's done for me, actually, is captured in a very succinct and moving way this importance of the variability in flow. Just let me try to paint a little bit of a picture, another picture of how that's so important. If you take a place like the Peace Athabasca Delta, remarkable productive ecosystem that exists where the Peace and the Athabasca rivers meet at the edge of Lake Athabasca in northern Alberta. During low flows, that ecosystem is habitat for bison. When the flows in the river rise and the delta becomes inundated, that same space, the same acre that one could be standing on watching bison, turns into a remarkable and productive habitat, spawning habitat for fish, and as well as for an amazing habitat for birds as well. So this is all tied back to the dynamics of river flow. I'm not ashamed to say that Martin Mittelstadt had a little bit of help in breaching these two worlds, the academic and his marvelous waxing and waning reference. That help came through this report that we released almost a year ago today. I think it's a couple weeks from now that we released our report, Canada's Rivers at Risk. This was the bridge between those two worlds, this report. We have copies, I think, here somewhere, and it's accessible online as well. So if you haven't seen a copy of the report, do let us know, and we'll make sure you get one. What we did in this report is looked at the health of 10 rivers through the lens of the science of environmental flows. Environmental flows is really the science that has pulled all this thinking around the natural variability of river flows into one cohesive body. Essentially, what the science of environmental flows tells us is that there are limits to the degree to which we can modify natural river flows before the ecosystems and the benefits that they provide us are compromised. What we found in this report, not surprisingly, I think, is that in Canada we have a remarkable opportunity to protect some of the world's last large wild rivers. But at the same time, and this was the surprising thing and the thing that caught headlines when we released this report, some of our rivers, in particular rivers like the South Saskatchewan, even the St. Lawrence and the St. John in New Brunswick, are in pretty big trouble from years and decades of overdevelopment. So what does it look like when we push those limits too far, when we push our rivers too far? Well, for the science folks, it can look a bit like this. This is a graph that will be public, I guess, next week. It's taken from our 2010 Living Planet report. This is a global report that we release that takes the pulse of biodiversity on a global scale. This is the freshwater index from that report. And you can think about this index in the same way as you would think about the TSX or the Dow Jones. It's an overall indicator of the health of biodiversity on the planet on a global scale. And as you can see from the graph, since 1970, the stock is down some 35%. Not good news. For those who think more in terms of pictures, this is what it can look like when we push the limits of our rivers too far. This is a shot borrowed from one of my global colleagues of the Yellow River in China. And that is indeed someone standing on the riverbed practicing Tai Chi, the dried riverbed. A little bit closer to home, on the continent, this is a shot of the Rio Grande, Rio Bravo, shared between Mexico and the United States. And here again, over abstraction of water, holding it back behind infrastructure, has caused this river that once met the sea each and every year to run dry during parts of the year and during some years. Unless we think that this can't happen in Canada, this is a shot of the South Saskatchewan River in the heart of the Canadian prairies. And this shot is actually quite interesting for a number of reasons. The quality, you'll note, is not maybe as good as some of the others you've seen up here, and that's because this was sent to me directly, actually, after we released our Rivers at Risk report. And it was sent to us by someone who had got their hands on the report and read it, I presume, and just happened to be a week or so later taking off from the Calgary airport and snapped this shot of the South Saskatchewan River in late October. And as you can see, this is one of the nation's most threatened rivers. Those are sandbars in the middle of what once was one of Canada's mightiest rivers. Not a good sign. For those of you who haven't seen this yet, Canadian Geographic has just released in their new issue a large, I think the whole issue is framed around the impacts of climate change, and water is one of the biggest stories in there. One of the biggest water stories in there, and their headline, the title of their article is "The South Saskatchewan Runs Dry." I encourage you to take a peek at that. I've gotten halfway through the article myself. It's a great look at the pressures on this river. So the Living Rivers campaign, the goal of the Living Rivers campaign is really to ensure that this type of situation is slowed and doesn't multiply across the country. Our goal, as we've stated it, is focused on policy. By 2017, and that date is chosen strategically, in fact, we have tied the goal that we've set out for ourselves here to Canada's 150th birthday. So by 2017, we hope to see the governments in Canada adopt and implement what we're calling a Living Rivers policy, a policy that protects and restores environmental flows in all of the nation's rivers. The reason why we focused our goal on public policy is because we think that's the best way for us to multiply our impact and our influence on a national scale. What we're really setting out to do is to be sure that all of Canada's rivers remain flowing healthy and strong. Now, of course, we can't be everywhere all the time. So we've laid out a strategic approach that we believe can take us to that overarching goal. The strategy includes three key elements. One, demonstrate success. What we want to be able to do, and what I think very much we need to be able to do, is show in tangible ways what it means to protect and restore environmental flows in Canada's rivers. A bit more on that in the coming slides. We'll use those demonstrations, those successes in conservation on the water, to leverage change at the level of public policy. And this will have to mount from the provinces upward if we're going to influence public policy around river health, in no small part because the provinces under our federation are the key jurisdiction responsible for water management. And then what we want to do is leave a legacy, leave behind a legacy that ensures that the policy changes that we see and so need result in real and lasting change. So the idea of this legacy is to leave behind a Living Rivers network, a network of organizations and individuals who are collectively watching out to ensure that the policies that we work so hard to have changed are in fact implemented and make real and lasting change in the water. So what does it mean to protect and restore environmental flows in Canada's rivers? Well, first and foremost, it means protecting what we have. There we go. Protecting Canada's wild waters. We are home to some of the planet's last large free-flowing rivers, rivers like the Mackenzie and the Fraser, that still flow from source to sea unimpeded by dams and other infrastructure. We are working hard already to protect some of Canada's wild waters. The Skeena on the west coast, a remarkable salmon stream, salmon river. And then, of course, the Mackenzie, one of Canada's largest rivers. But we have in mind a plan, an initiative that we're tentatively calling our Wild Waters Initiative to scale up that impact on a national level. But of course, not all of our waters are wild, nor can they be. Water is deeply embedded in our economy. It's embedded in the food that we are eating and the clothes that we have on. So that means we need to dig in and look beyond those places where we have an opportunity to just protect. It means tackling some of the most complex and challenging issues out there. Hydropower is one of the greatest impacts, hydropower dams are one of the greatest impacts on river health. However, hydropower is recognized as a renewable, reliable, and low-carbon source of energy. It is a major driver of the Canadian economy, and it is, in fact, a big part of the solution to the climate change challenge. So one of the challenges that we're faced with here is reconciling and balancing the demand for renewable energy, the need for renewable energy supply, and our notions around protecting and restoring river health. We're doing that in ways that are constructive, I believe. There are ways to design, develop, and operate hydropower dams and other infrastructure that we've constructed in our rivers in ways that do indeed manage better nature's needs for water, and in fact, in some cases, can restore environmental flows in our rivers. I'll use the St. Lawrence, a little example. We are working behind the scenes, primarily at this point, pushing a critical decision that's being made through an organization and a body called the International Joint Commission that many of you will be familiar with. That decision involves changing how the Moses Saunders Dam, the largest dam on the St. Lawrence, is operated. Changing how the dam is operated in order to restore more natural fluctuations in river flows. There's been a tremendous amount of really remarkable science done behind this, but we're at a critical point where a decision needs to be taken. So we're trying to influence that decision to see more natural flows return to Canada's largest, in terms of volume, anyhow, river. What that will do, of course, will restore habitat for muskrat and fish, and also restore many of the other values that many folks, including boaters, really value along that river system. Sometimes, however, in time, this infrastructure wears out or becomes less useful. This is a photo snapped about a week ago tomorrow, I believe, on site at Marden Creek, which is a small creek in the heart of the Grand River watershed. This is a project that we are working on in partnership with Trout Unlimited Canada, and what we're doing here is removing a small dam from the creek. This dam was originally constructed, this dam actually was originally constructed in 1925. There's been a dam on this site since the mid-1800s. This dam's predecessor was a stone dam that was originally developed to power a sawmill, the sawmill that helped clear the Grand River watershed and make that land accessible for agriculture. Down the road, the dam was used to power the grist mill to process the flour coming out of the fields of the Grand River watershed. Well, today, in 2010, the dam is no longer in use. It has no tangible, real value in terms of providing economic benefits. So what has happened in the course of this project is the folks at Trout Unlimited and their keen eyes for trout observed throughout this creek ecosystem a small population of native brook trout that had somehow hung on by a thread for a century or more. And when they found that, they began a project to begin removing a number of small dams on this creek. And this is the last of them. So it was a great honor and privilege really to be involved in this project. And it was quite inspiring for all of us that were on site to see real conservation in action. So don't let anybody ever tell you, when you're looking at this picture, of course, that conservation cannot involve heavy machinery. And I will assure you also that they left the conservationists out of the heavy machinery. They would not let us anywhere near it, of course. This is a real tangible example of what it means to protect and restore environmental flows. What this is doing, in fact, is opening up the entire creek now to that native brook trout population that we expect to see flourish going forward. For those familiar with the statistics around water use, agriculture is recognized as the largest consumer user of fresh water on the planet. On a global scale, that amounts to somewhere around 70% of the world's fresh water is used for agriculture. Of course, we need to eat. The challenge associated with agriculture, and we're seeing it in our South Saskatchewan River Basin, is that as the climate warms, flows and the water available to irrigate crops are declining, which makes the challenge of balancing water for agriculture and the water that nature needs to keep healthy rivers intact more difficult. This is really hitting hard in the prairies. And again, this article in Canadian Geographic gives a bird's eye view. This is a shot of one of many irrigation rigs on the prairies, in this case watering a field of potatoes. Addressing nature's water needs, protecting and restoring environmental flows in Canada's rivers also means wading into some often muddy waters. This is a shot, if you don't recognize it, of the tar sands region in northern Alberta. And back in the back corner, you can see the marvelous, remarkable Athabasca River. For the last 2 years, WWF, through our regional office in Edmonton, our folks Matt LaBelle and Rob Powell have been involved in something that we around the shop call the P2FC. The P2FC stands for the Phase 2 Framework Committee. Not a whole lot more telling, is it? I'll stick with P2FC. The P2FC is a multi-stakeholder decision-making body, planning body that has been struck by the governments, federal and provincial governments, to bring together a range of stakeholders around the table to develop a water management plan that protects the health of the Athabasca River in light of growing demands by the oil sands industry on that water. Well, for the past 2 years, as I've said, we've been involved in a very constructive discussion. And I'm pleased to report that one of our key principles going into the conversation, something that we call an ecosystem base flow. An ecosystem base flow essentially says that when flows in the river reach a certain low flow threshold, water withdrawals from the river should cease in order to protect the health of the river. Well, we've been successful in bringing that into the draft water management plan, but that only gets us 50% of the way there because it's only been accepted in principle. And having something accepted in principle, as I think you all know, is not enough for WWF. We want to see that principle put into practice. So we're still hard at work trying to get the other halfway there, negotiating with industry, with governments, and trying to raise public awareness about the importance of developing a water management plan for this river that protects the health of the overall river ecosystem and the species that inhabit it. This will be, when we are successful, a precedent-setting decision. It's precedent-setting for a number of reasons. One, it's in a pretty rough terrain to be negotiating around the importance of water and river health. But more importantly, this will be the first time that the federal and provincial governments have come together to reinforce and develop, and we hope, implement a water management plan for a river that explicitly protects and restores environmental flows. Something to watch out for. I hope that we can report in soon that we've been successful on this decision. And of course, as I mentioned a few times, all of this needs to be considered on a backdrop of climate change. As we say, water is how people will come to know that the climate is changing. This is a marvelous shot, I believe, of the Columbia Glacier. Is that right? It's very telling. You know, in 1844, the glacier was here. There's now a parking lot where the glacier once was. Just last month, Statistics Canada released a report that told us that in southern Canada, renewable water supplies, that's the water that falls on the land each year and runs off through rivers, lakes, and streams. Our renewable water supply has declined by about 8.5% in southern Canada over the last 40 years. What that means, in essence, is less water available where most of us live and most of us work. And what that means is the challenge of protecting water for nature becomes that much more difficult. Sandra Postal, a globally recognized water expert, suggests that when we're thinking about water in the context of climate change, what we really need to be thinking about is adapting to a new normal. So what will it take for WWF to realize our vision under the Living Rivers campaign? Well, first and foremost, we need to begin communicating the case for Canada's rivers. We have some early thoughts in mind to do that through things like documentaries, books, and, of course, using all the whiz-bang tools of social media. We need to begin designing an effective and implementable campaign architecture. That campaign architecture will include tools for policy guidance, science, and engagement. And their tools are designed for us to use, but also to be used by partners who want to take up the cause of protecting and restoring environmental flows in their own watersheds. We need to continue and build on delivering visible and tangible in the water successes. Of course, not all what may be as tangible as the dam removal on Marden Creek. Some will be a step removed, like the water management plan for the Athabasca River. But their implementation, these tangible examples, will, we believe, result in real progress in terms of protecting river health. We need to begin identifying and engaging leaders in water policy reform in order to scale up our on-the-ground efforts to have a more broad impact on water policy. The two jurisdictions taking the lead in this country on revising and reforming their water policy in order to protect and restore environmental flows are British Columbia and Alberta. And we are at the moment engaged in conversations around water policy reform in both of those areas. We need to begin creating networks and coalitions across diverse interests. One of the key challenges I mentioned was working on the issue of hydropower and the impacts on river health. The most logical way for us to get at that issue is by working with the hydropower sector to understand their challenges and bring our concerns to the table with them. I just corresponded this morning with the chair, I believe, the president of the Canadian Hydropower Association, and we'll be meeting in a couple weeks at their annual Hydro Forum to talk about how we can begin moving this conversation forward. And of course, we need to mobilize the finances to sustain a long-term effort. And in fact, some of the folks in the room today and with us on the phone have been instrumental to getting us to where we are today, so I just want to acknowledge those folks. So why rivers? Why focus our attention on rivers for the next 7 years to celebrate something big for Canada's 150th birthday? Well, I hope through my various academic articles I've made a bit of a scientific case for that, but there's also a very strong cultural case for protecting and restoring the health of Canada's rivers. They are the highways that form the nation. People often refer to them as the veins of life of the continent. Many of our largest cities, if you look at the map, have been developed on rivers. Vancouver on the Fraser, Calgary at the confluence of the Bow and the Elbow rivers, the nation's capital on the Ottawa River, St. John on the St. John River, and of course, Toronto has a good number of rivers flowing through it. The rivers of Canada are deeply embedded in our culture. And I thought I would leave you with a quote from, and I even brought the real thing today, this book by one of my favorite Canadian authors, Hugh MacLennan. And this is a book that MacLennan wrote first in 1961 called The Seven Rivers of Canada. In this book, he brought together 7 essays on the rivers of Canada that really shed light on the character and spirit of the nation's rivers and shed some early light on the growing human pressures on the health of our rivers. I think the quote that I pulled here is quite telling in terms of the importance of the health of the rivers to the nation. To know the rivers is to know Canada, for much of the nation's character and experience is bound up with them. So the scale of our ambition for the Living Rivers campaign that I provided you some early thinking on here today rivals that of our Endangered Spaces campaign from the 1990s. Many of you will know that, I think, better than I. In that campaign, we were successful in doubling the amount of protected areas in Canada over the course of a decade. We want to build on that with the Living Rivers campaign. We're targeting river flow. We're targeting river flow by protecting it in wild waters, by managing it better in those rivers that we've tamed through development, and in restoring flows in those systems that have been highly degraded. So as friends and supporters of WWF over the years, I hope that I've provided you some insight, some inspiration to get behind us on this campaign. We're just at the early days, but I see before us a massive opportunity to make a huge mark and deliver to Canada for its 150th birthday a gift of healthier, stronger, and flowing rivers. So with that, I'll say thank you.